We're going to go to the phone lines now this hour because Javier's on the line with us. Javier, good to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happening here in the United States. You know, we've talked a lot about these pro-Palestinian demonstrations. Well, we're starting to push activism limits when it comes to the corporate world. How are these protests in the corporate world colliding?
Right. So this kind of famous example we've seen now was at Google in San Francisco, or Silicon Valley of all places, where Google fired 28 employees who were performing some kind of sit-in there at work and protesting a contract Google was negotiating with Israel.
And so what's the fine line of having your religious beliefs, standing up for that, and then, you know, making sure you're not getting fired for that at the same time?
You know, I agree it's a fine line, and this is obviously a very tough topic, but it's a business, right? And in the private sector, you don't have kind of the same First Amendment rights. It's a private business that can set the rules for the workplace. So, you know, you have to be even-handed with people on those bases, religion, race, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you know, the employer gets to decide what is the environment of the workplace, and especially if it's disruptive or disturbing other employees, they really have a right to control that setting.
We're speaking this morning with Javier Pérez. He's a legal expert, 842 here on DFW's Morning News. We're talking about how corporate America is basically lowering its tolerance for activism. Is that everywhere, though, it seems? You know, I've seen some people who obviously they got off of work, whether it was an excused absence or they asked off or they said they were sick, whatever it may be. Some of this stuff is happening during the day. And I also wonder, how much business is it of your employer, you know, what you're participating in and not?
Right. That's a good question. So stuff that's going on outside of the workplace, we generally like to think we can kind of live our own lives. But when folks don't have contracts that may stipulate that, you know, a code of conduct outside of work, you know, an employer can discipline you and decide what kind of people it wants working for them. If they are, you know, getting arrested, for example. I mean, you may see it different as you got arrested at the protest versus you got arrested for a DWI. But, you know, people lose their jobs for kind of picking up criminal charges often. So what you do outside of work does reflect on your employer. And to a certain extent, they have the right to sort of, you know, control what the people who work for them are doing, but definitely at work and in some circumstances outside of work.
Is it a little risky, though? Because I'm sure these corporations have to realize with the decisions that they make, there could be some repercussions like lawsuits from these former employers coming back at them. I'm sure that's something that they heavily consider before making these decisions. Absolutely.
I mean, they really are kind of a tough spot because, you know, these protests are tied to, as was mentioned earlier, people's religions, people's ethnicities, the kind of, you know, what part of the world they're from. And if you're not coming down as hard on other people doing similar stuff, that's a prime area for a lawsuit. So really have to think about what are our policies and are we applying them evenly? I mean, it can be coming down hard, but if you do that, you got to come down hard on everybody.
Right. Javier Pérez, legal expert, talking about how you handle these protests in the workplace. Just got about 30 seconds left. You know, when it comes to politics, this is nothing new. Probably best to keep politics out of the workplace. I'm just wondering, have you heard that it's more difficult to do that now with all of the protests and with all of the attention on not only this conflict, but the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict too, just where we are as a world? Is it tougher now?
I think so. And part of that's kind of a function of, you know, the information age that we're in. We're also kind of keenly aware of what's going on around us, and that, you know, inevitably forms opinions, and people get, you know, have strong feelings about these kind of controversial topics. And we're human, right? We can't completely turn off our feelings. But at the same time, the employer has to make sure everybody feels safe, feels productive, and you're not kind of making the situation hostile for anybody. that's where the trick is.
Yeah. All right, legal expert Javier Pérez, thanks for coming on DFW's Morning News.
You bet. Thanks for having me.